For me, the biggest difference between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation is whether or not you understand the fundamental principles and the fundamental pillars upon which the culture is built. So, the logic behind this is that you cannot appreciate something that you do not understand. But you can, on the other hand, appropriate something even without having this fundamental understanding of it. So, for example, in the video, when we see certain people in Japan appropriating these cholo culture or this chilango culture, it is not from a point of understanding, rather from a point of having seen the aesthetic and liking the aesthetic and appropriating it without having the fundamental understanding of why that culture is that way or why it exists. So, for example, when we see Sad Girl, she discusses how she makes music from an understanding point of view. And so she is doing a cultural appreciation. She understands the culture, she understands where it comes from, the principles, the values. She understands that it's rebellion, she understands that it is, well, yeah, like a rebellious culture that goes against the status quo because it was comes from a historical period where Mexican people in the United States were being racially discriminated, and it was a way of fighting back against this cultural oppression, and she understands this and she makes music from this understanding. So her music is a clear example of cultural appreciation. Whereas when we observe the people who listen to her music, even though this music comes from a point of understanding, the people who listen to the music and adopt the aesthetic don't understand these fundamental principles. They don't do the research, they don't care to look beyond probably a Pinterest board of what this looks like, and then we see a clear example of cultural appropriation. And so it's really interesting because the same Sad Girl says how she thinks that this kind of culture is going to die with her in Japan because the next generation can only appreciate the aesthetic. And if you can only appreciate the aesthetic, then they're only going to end up migrating to the next popular aesthetic amongst the generation because the real cultural background is not there, it's not present, it's not adopted, so it doesn't really exist. And so they're going to migrate, and this culture is going to become diminished and eventually eradicated in this zone of Japan. So that is also a good differentiation between cultural appropriation and cultural appreciation is the longevity of the cultural representation. And so because when you appreciate culture and you understand the fundamental principles, there's longevity to that because if you adopt this kind of culture, it's because you likely feel identified with core values and principles, which means that there's a certain longevity implied. Whereas when you only feel identified with an aesthetic or a look, it constantly changes and it is a shorter period of time, which is also damaging to cultures. Okay, so when I go to other countries, I like to think that I'm a good example of cultural appreciation. When I step on a foreign land or I step into a foreign culture, I do like to believe that I like to understand the culture. And when I adopt certain elements from certain cultures, I like to think that it's from a point of cultural appreciation because I understand the meaning in another cultural context. So, for example, when I say go to France or go to Italy or even go to another state within my own country, I like to think that I do so in a position of wanting to understand their culture and wanting to appreciate their culture rather than just wanting to wear a beret and eat a croissant and say that I'm a French girl. And I think that that is a really big difference. I think that tourism often borderline relies on cultural appropriation, but I think that the correct way to do tourism or tourism should be a more than just cultural appropriation and eating a croissant and saying that you went to France, rather really understanding the principles of the French and the French culture, for example. So yeah, that is my take on this subject. Thank you.